when you do the lecture, we'll go and sit down there.
Okay.
And then I'll come back up for the Q&A.
Clap your hands. Are we going to this one?
Sorry? Oh, brilliant. Yeah. What did you say?
This one. So everybody, it gives me very great pleasure to welcome you to the Geddes lecture. I'm the principal of Teddy Hall, and this lecture's been held through the college since 1988 in memory of Philip Geddes, who came to the hall in 1977 to read English. And after graduating, Philip went to an incredibly successful career as a journalist. First of all, he joined the staff of the London Evening Standard and then the Daily Express. But in December 1983, he was in the Harrods store in Knightsbridge in London when orders were issued for the building to be evacuated. Now, as a budding journalist and realising there was a story to be had, he did exactly what he shouldn't have done, which he went to investigate, and tragically was killed by a blast from the bomb planted by the IRA, along with a number of police and pedestrians and others who were around at that time. Philip Geddes was actually only 24 at the time and an absolute rising star in journalism. In college, over the road, we have a tree and a plaque in the gardens of St Edmund Hall to commemorate his life, and each year a memorial service is held outside Harrods at the time that the bomb went off. Now, a trust was also set up in memory of Philip, called the Geddes Trust, and the aim of the trust is to award prizes to promising student journalists in the university, and it has been doing so since 1998, and also to bring an eminent speaker to deliver the Philip Geddes annual lecture. So the chairman of the Philip Geddes Trust is Peter Cardwell, who's next to me on the stage here this evening, and it gives me very great pleasure to welcome him to the stage and to introduce the speaker for this year's annual Geddes lecture.
Thank you, Cathy. Thanks very much indeed, Cathy, and thank you for all your support through the year. I'm delighted we have our physical lecture this year again as we come out of COVID, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing what Krishnan has to say in just a few minutes. We have two sets of winners this year because our 2021 winners, obviously there was not a physical lecture last year, but I know many people joined us for that with Mark Thompson last year, so thank you for that. So our 2021 winners, one of them sadly can't be here because he's in America, which seems to me like a reasonable excuse. And we've got two others, Lewis Heslop of LMH, who won the Geddes Prize, and Lauren Sheriff of Balliol, who won the Ronnie Payne Prize, joined us this evening. As I said, Aaron Orby, who won the Clive Taylor Prize, is in America. But Lewis and Lauren, perhaps you would stand up and have your long-awaited round of applause. And in terms of this year's prizes, the Geddes Prize, the Philip Geddes Prize of £2,500 was won by Adam Posner of St Anne's College, who will go to New York to write about the Jewish punk scene. Maggie Wang of Pembroke College won the £2,000 Ronnie Payne Prize, and she will go to the Amazon to look at the role of infrastructure in shaping people's lives. Maurizio Alencar of St Edmund Hall, first time in a while, winner from St Edmund Hall, has won the Clive Taylor Prize of £2,000, and he's off to Brazil to look at how football is influenced by politics. So Adam, Maggie and Maurizio, well done. Stand up and have your round of applause. Just a word on the Clive Taylor Prize itself. It was fully funded some years ago by a great man called Bernie Coleman in memory of Clive Taylor, the cricket writer he described as his greatest friend. Clive Taylor's daughter Lynn Hedworth is here this evening. Bernie died last November, just short of his 98th birthday, and alert and interested to the end, would have been astonished at the extent of the obituaries and accolades in the national press. Being someone who loathed the limelight personally, few realised the extent of his achievements. He was a key figure in the running of Surrey Cricket Club for many years, when he famously entertained the Queen at the Oval, explaining to her the finer points of the game. She was only due to stay for an hour, but she chose to stay longer. As Bernie said later, how many people have the privilege of talking to the Queen for 2 hours? He was also a leading administrator on the Test and County Cricket Boards, who was recently described as the first real modern marketeer of the English game. Clive Taylor once said that Bernie was largely responsible for saving county cricket by initially the introduction of advertising into the grounds and subsequently revolutionising TV coverage and sponsorship. It was also Bernie who suggested to Rupert Murdoch that Sky Sports should bid for the Premier League football coverage rights. In 1990, he was awarded the OBE for services to sport and his charitable work. But it was the combination of his business skills and his warmth and generosity that made him exceptional. He was always prepared to offer sound, unflinching advice to his devoted friends and colleagues, but his passion was cricket and creating opportunities in sport and journalism for young people in general. It was for this reason that he sponsored the Clive Taylor Prize. He also bought the failing Wimbledon Football Club and restored it to good financial health, and then sold it on without profit. The obituary on Wimbledon FC's website is headed, "The Man Who Saved the Dons." He then became involved with Crystal Palace, using those funds from the sale to set up his own charitable trust, which supports and encourages young sports people and will continue to do so. Much of Bernie's outstanding support was carried out anonymously. He sponsored new plays on the London stage. Boris Karloff, a great cricket lover, was one of his greatest friends. He bailed out bankrupt and now very famous musicians, and more recently, in the few weeks before he died, he bought numerous season tickets from AFC Wimbledon and Surrey Cricket Club to donate to the children. When John Woodcock, the Times cricket correspondent, died last year, everyone said how sad it was. Bernie disagreed. No, it's not. It's never sad when anyone in their 90s dies. If only that were true. The world is a poorer place, but Richard Spiller, the journalist Bernie had entrusted to write his biography, got it right when he said, "Yes, but we were all the richer for knowing him." Let's acknowledge his contribution. Sadly, our great friend Peter Freeman also left us this year. Peter worked with the Geddes Trust and was a steadfast supporter of the Trust's work, both in person and at every possible event, and as well as financially. Peter was an inveterate writer with an extraordinary command of English and an unerring habit of correcting poor grammar and Americanisms. In some ways, Peter was a person from an earlier age, definitely preferring back to the Beatles. In fact, one might say he devoted his life to the arts. When he was a teenager, he got a job at the confectionery stand at Covent Garden so that he could sneak in and hear the second half. I'm told he preferred to stand in the middle of the gods in many concert halls because the acoustics were optimal. We remember Peter today. The Geddes lecture this evening, as well as our masterclass and prize judging, does not happen by itself each year, and I want to say thank you to my fellow Geddes trustees, particularly Tony Diver for setting up the masterclass, and to Harry Hodges for overseeing a major website revamp. I would also like to thank Emma Byrne, Paddy Coulter, Molly Lynch and Mariana Spring, as well as our Geddes fellow Professor Wes Williams, and of course Christopher Wilson set it all up in the first place, so we wouldn't be standing here without him. Patrick McGuire and Yvette Shapiro also helped with the judging process. Numerous people at the hall have been helpful again this year, not least Elaine Evers, Claire Parfitt, and especially Casey Charlesworth. Casey is very sadly leaving Teddy Hall for pastures new. So Casey, as a trust, we would like to say thank you to you for all your brilliant work. We will miss your diligence, your patience, your good humour, and your cat photos. So we've got you this. Two very quick reminders. On the 17th of December every year at 1 p.m. at Harrods, there is a remembrance service for Philip Geddes and indeed all those killed and injured in the 1983 IRA terrorist bomb. Please join us there if you can. It's a very short, simple service and it's great to see people there every year. Secondly, please follow us on Twitter. We're at Geddes Trust. Krishnan Guru-Murthy has been a fixture on our screens remarkably for over 30 years. I remember as a child watching him on BBC Newsround when he wasn't... Sorry, Krishnan.
Thank you. Yes.
When he wasn't many years older than me. You've got to wait for the second bit of that sentence. Later, I remember him giving a talk to me as a student journalist here in Oxford when he mentioned to us that something that has always stayed with me, indeed I've recycled the point myself when giving talks, when he said, there are journalists who cover and there are journalists who uncover. and Krishnan has always been a journalist who has uncovered. Krishnan has had tremendous success throughout his career at the BBC, at LBC, and especially, of course, at Channel 4 News, where we know him best, not least in very recent days when he won Network Presenter of the Year at the Royal Television Society Awards. Let me just read the citation to you. The judges thought the winner has become one of the outstanding presenters of his generation. He harnesses his assured broadcasting presence and writing skills to doggedly pursue a story with nerve and directness. He is bold and brave and gutsy. He doesn't flinch from asking the direct and tough question. It is a privilege to say that the 2022 Philip Geddes Memorial Lecture will now be given by Krishnan Guru-Murthy.
Thank you, Peter. That's a very kind introduction. You know that Peter is a real journalist because just before he came up here, he asked me if I had a pen. And you know that I'm a journalist because the only reason I had a pen was because I was finishing my notes just before we came in here. I haven't been in this room since 1992, so I'm sort of filled with that chilled feeling of finals and examinations and general fear, but I feel very honoured that so many people have come here tonight. So thank you, and thank you for the invitation to give this lecture in honour of Philip Geddes, an Oxford graduate who achieved so much in so short a time, and who would surely have given so much to the questions we wrestle with here. You know, to be a reporter on a national daily newspaper at the age of 24 was extraordinary, and testament, I am sure, to his determination to get the story, that tenacity, dedication and curiosity that the best journalists need to succeed. His example is one which I know the winners of these excellent prizes tonight will follow. Now, Philip came south to Oxford from Barrow. I came here from a Lancashire village called Barrowford. I have no doubt, like me, he would have arrived here in Oxford with some trepidation, surrounded by people who had always expected to be here, wondering if we had what it takes. He made a great success of his time as a student and then his time as a journalist until, in 1983, the IRA robbed us of a man who would no doubt have become one of the great reporters of his generation. Yet, we remember him every year, and I know his family, including Sarah McKay, are great supporters of the Geddes Trust, and with many of Philip's friends and colleagues are here today, so thank you. Now, I started working as a TV journalist in 1988, in the year before I started here as a student at Oxford, mostly for the BBC. For ordinary people, the internet didn't exist. When it came to media, the question of in whom we trust seemed a lot simpler. Surveys would show that broadly, people trusted what they read in newspapers almost as much as what they heard or watched on broadcast. And in a way, you would expect that. People chose their newspapers. So why would they buy something they didn't trust? To me, as a consumer, the distinction between papers and broadcast was pretty clear. You chose your newspapers according to your taste and your politics and your wish to understand other people's. You didn't expect them to be impartial, and they had no regulated duty to be so. But broadcasters did. There were only 4 of them. They had strict rules about impartiality. They were watched by many millions every night. Television news presenters had become the most trusted people in Britain. And when I joined the BBC, perhaps especially because I was working for the children's news programme, Newsround, I had that ethic of fairness, impartiality, taking care to leave my views at the door and represent all sides of an argument as best I could, absolutely drummed into me. Newsround at the time was one of the most watched news programmes on television, full stop, with adult viewers who far outstripped breakfast programmes and Newsnight's audience put together. So we were the first news programme on air after the lunchtime news and would often be the first to break big stories of the day. There were no news channels. That sense of responsibility then, that viewers were trusting you, that parents were trusting you with their children to tell them the truth, weighed heavily on my 21-year-old shoulders. Now, call me an ostrich, but I have never believed that there is an actual crisis of trust in broadcast journalism, despite having debated this for about 30 years. And this is because time and again, when asked whether they trust the TV and radio news, people still tend to say yes in pretty large numbers. Now, don't get me wrong, clearly our relationship with the media has changed, and rightly so. We are more questioning as consumers, more critical, less accepting of tablets of truth handed down by the television. And it is clear that there is a very vocal minority who are actually pretty angry with public service broadcasters. Some, and these tend to be on the left politically, according to survey evidence, think that the broadcasters have been guilty of a false equivalence, of giving airtime to people whose values or beliefs they believe are patently wrong and shouldn't be tolerated. That the principle of impartiality and equal time to different sides is misguided. It is clear that young people feel the most unsure about the current offering, because one respected survey found that while 49% of people aged over 55 feel that television covers them fairly, just 20% of the 18 to 24s think so. Others, who tend to be on the right, think the media is infused with social liberalism, will generally side with identity and progressive politics. It is important for us in broadcast journalism to understand more what the problem is and be less dismissive of the views of the minorities. For much of the last 40 years or so, the broadcast media satisfied itself that so long as it was being criticised by people on the left and right, it must be doing something right. That balance has been achieved. How many times have you seen a presenter on Twitter quote critics who contradict each other and conclude that they, the presenter, must be impartial as a result? I would argue this is clearly a trap. And one of the reasons our critics feel so aggrieved and unlistened to, because the centre is not neutral. It is a political position which often wields power. It is a bias and needs to be thought about and countered in the way we approach questions and the way we question our interviewees. Now, according to the Reuters Institute Digital News Report, the Brexit referendum was pretty disastrous for trust in TV news, and it fell sharply from 50% to below 30%. But there is good reason to believe, I believe, that this is a temporary, not permanent change, and it is rescuable. Last year, after about 18 months of pandemic, which saw anti-vaxxers and fake news about science flood our social media, trust in TV news increased by several points, to 36% or so in Britain. And I believe the war in Ukraine will see that trend continue. The historian and political expert Peter Hennessy, in his new book, A Duty of Care, makes the argument that right now we are akin to a post-war environment after COVID, in which much of the country wants to break free from the culture wars and to find a new consensus for how we can make Britain better. Much like the post-Second World War period that saw the creation of the NHS and the welfare state after Beveridge's Five Giants. Hennessy argues there is a unique window of opportunity to bring the nation together around some common goals, even for people who disagree about a lot of things. Who knows whether he's right? It would certainly be nice. But a trusted public service media which tests, challenges, holds to account, and reveals is exactly what we need, if that is the case. Not the shouting matches of deregulated, opinionated radio turned into TV that seems to be all the rage right now. Ask yourselves why it's all the rage. Because airing culture wars in a studio, or even talking shop about faraway wars, is easier and cheaper than real on-the-ground journalism, which seeks to uncover. That is time-consuming, investigative, dangerous, and expensive to make. I firmly believe that's what we need more of, not the American-style studio-based ego trips that we are being lined up with. It may look like public service broadcasting. It may even have some well-known names and faces from public service broadcasters. But it isn't public service broadcasting. It is monetizing division. Just look at the product of that shift in television news in America, where on January the 6th last year, when the mob stormed the Capitol in Washington, when people were killed and many more were threatened, it took a British team of journalists led by ITN's Robert Moore to do the most basic of things for television news, the thing we were all told to do from day one. Just follow, watch what happens, ask them questions, and report it. Almost nobody else did that. None of the networks, none of the British broadcasters. The American networks were too busy sitting in their studios or standing at their live spots arguing about the commotion going on behind them than to actually go and see what was happening. Again, I believe the war in Ukraine will highlight why we need people to go, to see, to tell us what's happening. And again, survey evidence tells us 3/4 of people want news to be impartial and give equal time to all sides of the argument. They don't, on the whole, want TV to take sides and tell them what to think. So impartiality is what most people in the marketplace want. But is impartiality a good thing in itself? For many, it is tempting to pretend it is impossible, to succumb to the widespread American argument against its old fairness doctrine in television, which was much like ours, that free speech is more important, that the idea of a state body being able to adjudicate over what can and can't be said on television news is anti-democratic, that the idea that a TV station can be forced to apologize and correct itself, or even be fined because some old establishment figures who've been promoted by their political allies can decide that that's terrible, that everyone is biased, and to pretend that you can be truly impartial is a lie. The idea that there's more honesty in presenters who tell you what they think and where they're coming from is already taking hold in quite a lot of our broadcast media. There is no doubt that Piers Morgan has moved the dial in Britain. And even after his demise, having opinionated news presenters is now standard on his old show, Good Morning Britain, and elsewhere. TV is borrowing from talk radio stations who have convinced the regulators that so long as a biased presenter is balanced out by an opposite biased guest or a co-presenter, impartiality has been satisfied. The recent moves by some of those big stars at the BBC to places where they feel freer to say what they think suggest we will see more of this. My opinion, and that's all it is that this is a dangerous road. Impartiality is not a precise science. It is an art. It is an idea to which we aspire. We try to leave our opinions at the door, to check our innate biases, to examine arguments we might find instinctively unattractive, and ferociously scrutinize the arguments we are naturally drawn to. As an interviewer, my approach must always be the same, whoever is in power and wherever I am. To think about my interviewee's position and question it, to pick at the weak points and the inconsistencies, to explore the potential strengths. Sometimes, with a politician, it might be to test their temperament, to see how easily rattled they are, how impatient they might become. I'm quite good at that one. It doesn't make you popular, but it's not my job to be friends with people in power, to be the one they leak stories to. It is my job to represent viewers and their concerns, to hold power to account, to ask the questions people at home might ask. For me, as a viewer, I've always felt that means it's better not to know the opinions of the questioner, because they have to represent everyone. And if viewers know that's what we're all striving for, is that they will continue to trust us. What I fear is the growth of opinionated broadcasting that seeks to recruit tribes. It poisons the well and undermines us all. Because if Fox News, or whatever it might be, looks the same as the BBC or Channel 4 News, presents itself with the same television grammar and visual cues, sometimes even the same old faces, will it become harder for viewers to tell them apart, to believe that one is truly seeking fairness and balance, while the other has no real interest in that at all? Now, there's nothing like an actual war to make a culture war look vacuous. And the culture war has been a major disruptor of trust in institutions, education, government, and the broadcast media. But first, because of the pandemic, and now with the war in Ukraine, I believe we are in a new phase. a more grown-up and serious one. A time when the hitherto instinct of a deeply divided Britain, turning on itself, wants out of those arguments and wants to find things it agrees on. So my aim today is to hail a rise in trust in public service broadcasting, an awakening about the misinformation and fake news on social media, and hopefully a fizzling out of some of the more corrosive aspects of the culture war and the approaches to journalism that it has spawned. Only yesterday, the Culture Secretary, who weeks ago had criticised what she saw as BBC bias and questioned whether the BBC would even exist in 10 years' time, cracked with emotion in the House of Commons as she praised the BBC and other British broadcast journalists for bringing us unbiased and accurate news from a live war zone. It was a remarkable moment to see. Now, although Britain is not at war with Russia, there is a clear sense already that this affects us and will do increasingly. It is already obvious to most that for sanctions to really bite, it is going to take significant economic pain for Europe, and more than focusing on some oligarchs or the SWIFT financial messaging system. Observers have already pointed out that much of what is being thrown at Russia so far has applied to Iran for years. It hasn't collapsed or had regime change. So more is going to be needed if our political leaders are going to follow through with their rhetoric of making Putin rue the day he invaded Ukraine. That means oil and gas. And that means the already sharp cost of living crisis is going to get worse as demands to stop keeping the Kremlin in business get louder. And just like other public service broadcasters, we have seen on Channel 4 News in the last week an extraordinary thirst for information. Audiences have leapt up by 50% on television. The number of young viewers aged between 16 and 24 has almost doubled on this time last year. Special programs in the day, when audiences are normally small, are getting huge viewing figures online, as millions view our programs not on Channel 4, but on YouTube. And conscious efforts to reach younger viewers by repackaging all that news on Snapchat, TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook are again getting millions of views. All of which suggests that in a time of crisis and insecurity, even young people are seeking out trusted brands for news that they can believe. They are developing the same habits as older viewers because they are right at the sharp end of the problem. That believing anything has become almost impossible, even when the falsehoods are blatant. Because, of course, it is blindingly obvious that the first casualty of war is truth. This morning, as we awoke, a fire at Ukraine's biggest nuclear power plant after reports of a Russian attack. There were counterclaims that the Ukrainians had started the fire themselves to pull NATO into the war. Only yesterday, Vladimir Putin again claimed the invasion was in fact to denazify the Ukraine. Now, like all good misinformation, he will know that there is enough of a grain of truth in the denazifying accusation to confuse us. There have been a small number of far-right supporters in parts of Ukraine that some militia with fascist insignia have been absorbed into the armed forces since the 2014 takeover of Crimea. But it takes only a little research to put this in proper context and examine the numbers, to work out that recently Ukraine was the only place except for Israel to have a Jewish head of state and a Jewish prime minister at the same time. That President Zelensky, who is Jewish, has led a party that won a convincing and overall electoral victory in a respected democratic system. And thus to suggest Ukraine has been taken over by Nazis or that the population has been brainwashed by fascists is laughably untrue. And the proposition that there was a genocide going on in the Donbass is another untruth. We had become so unsure now of where the line is between truth and lies that even though the invasion followed days and weeks of saying there would be no invasion, some people have been unsure whether it's a lie, a mistake, or a difference of opinion. So they are turning to trusted news sources, not to be told what to think, but to enable them with facts and reportage and testimony from people on the ground to help viewers make up their minds what they think. That is our job as television journalists. Of course, you might look at the war and say, well, television reporters have had their day. This is a war that is being televised by the people, shot by everyone on the street with a smartphone. So much of the material we are watching is this user-generated content, rather than television news crews on the scene at the time. Uploaded to social media, it is the democratization of news, with unmediated footage of real events. And that, of course, is true up to a point. But how do you know what you're watching? How do you know whether it is real, current, unstaged, even from this war? So much of the video on social media at the moment is either fake, old, or from a different conflict. Just last week, video went viral of a supposed standoff between Ukrainian and Russian forces. It turned out to be from 2014. So much of our time back at the Channel 4 News office now is checking social media video and trying to verify it. That way, the viewer knows that everything they see with our badge on it has been looked into and checked. And it's a time-consuming but not overly complex process. It means things like checking buildings against satellite imagery or maps, anything else that might give you a clue of the time or location. But it is a time-consuming process, and it means that getting that video into your news bulletin is a lot more painstaking than just retweeting it on social media. But we want our viewers to be able to trust us and to say that we have contextualized our reports, that our reports are confirmed. It is no wonder, amidst a war and after a pandemic, that the trust gap then between television and social media has grown widely in the last 5 years. Half of us believe we have seen misinformation and fake news on our social media feeds. But many of us don't notice it at the time or think it applies to other people. When Channel 4 News got hold of Donald Trump's election database from 2016, we were able to see how the campaign used social media advertising. What we focused on was what the Trump campaign did with people it could identify as Democrats, as less likely to vote Trump because they were from deprived minorities, mostly black or Hispanic voters. Instead of trying to persuade them to vote Trump, they set about persuading them not to vote at all by just putting them off Hillary Clinton, suggesting she was a racist. It was, said some, old-fashioned voter suppression using modern social media and fake news. And it was only when I went door to door, in a very old journalism way, looking for the names on that database, asking them if they recall seeing those ads on their social media feeds, that many of them started to realize how they had been manipulated. Of course, before the war began, British news had been dominated for 2 months by another question of trust and truth. Something as far away from war as it's possible to get. The Partygate scandal of alleged Downing Street rule-breaking, Christmas parties, and the rest. Boris Johnson's survival was in the balance. Beyond trust in politicians and the government, the conduct of the police and their lateness investigating played into the crisis of trust in the Met that was already so bad because of misogyny, racism, and corruption allegations. Almost every night, we were standing outside Downing Street wondering if the Prime Minister could survive. How long ago that now seems. And it isn't over. But what will happen when the fixed penalty notices land and Sue Gray's full report is finally published is now very uncertain. Where does it sit with the public and the media when the threat of being dragged into war is so close and the talk and fear once again is of nuclear weapons? It is almost impossible to predict. But suddenly it seems as possible that the whole thing will be brushed away for now as inconsequential in deeply serious times. The cliches of events, dear boy, and a week being a long time in politics are cliches for a reason. But we will have eventually to return to the question of how to report at home facts and tell the truth when people in or around politics, whether they are campaigners, commentators, or people in power themselves, are prepared to look you in the eye and say things that just aren't true. Now, I've no doubt some of it is our fault. The media can be cruel, relentless, a pack looking to catch politicians out rather than seeking wisdom. I can understand how that can lead to some sort of defensive mentality. But we also have to hope that if we enter a post-culture war period for a while, that dynamic between the media and politics might change too. Our responsibility as journalists will remain simple: to ask the right questions, to uncover the truth wherever we can, and to hold power to the standards it claims it has. Finally, we cannot expect to be trusted if we do not reflect the country that we serve. Despite 2 years of very conscious coverage of the anti-racism movements that followed the murder of George Floyd, we've seen quite a shocking period over the last few days of the way the war in Ukraine has been reported. We've seen a lot of journalists talking about people like us. Suddenly this is a war involving people like us. They could be us, I heard Tim Stanley say on Thought for the Day the other day, in a way that other conflicts couldn't. And there have been many examples of this from all around the world. It's not a British problem. It's been on international news channels as well. But it has revealed the truth about where we are in terms of cultural change, which is that there is ingrained cultural bias in many of our newsrooms, which we need to tackle. It is alienating to huge numbers and huge proportions of our audience, and if we want them to trust us and to feel that we understand where they're coming from, we are going to have to address this properly. It's been quite a revealing couple of weeks. Because my fear, as we go on through this war in Ukraine, is that people there might start asking journalists why they should tell their stories. I learned at a very early age in my career, while I was still at university, in fact, covering the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, that you would go into places, and after a while, when the media had been in a place for a long time, and the war had still been going on, and Superman wasn't coming to the rescue, and the West wasn't coming in to stop the war, people started asking, why should I trust you as foreign journalists? Why should I tell my story? What difference does it make? Now, we're not there to change their lives. We're not there to inspire NATO to do something that it doesn't intend to do. That's not our job as impartial journalists. But we have to keep being able to tell those stories and telling their truth. Telling their truth is an aim in itself, not because it will change the course of history, but at least that history will be recorded with honesty and integrity. And if we can promise to do that as journalists, we at least will have done our job. Thank you very much.
That was super. Really brilliant. Thank you. Krishnan, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for such a thought-provoking lecture. I should say that there are, of course, people watching on YouTube as well as the people in the hall, so you'll forgive me if I just consult my phone because I've got some questions from people both watching at home who can't make it this evening and, of course, people in the hall as well. I wonder if I could use the chairman's privilege to ask you a couple of questions first, actually. There is a definite, I'm not saying this is wrong at all, but there is a definite clear-headed decision in the vast majority of the UK public that Ukraine is in the right and Russia is in the wrong. How do you tell that story impartially?
You do your best to tell the truth, to examine all sides of the argument, to examine the Russian arguments as well, and to treat them rigorously. Now, just because Vladimir Putin does a long historical lesson in his justification for war, doesn't mean that you don't question it and point out where it may be wrong. But you have to I think you have to, make an honest attempt at understanding their motivation. It is not our job to take sides, and it's not our job to be cheerleaders. It is our job to tell that story with understanding and with humanity. I think this is for teams on the ground, it's a real challenge, I think, because you are there with victims of war. They're being bombed, they're being killed, they're losing their homes. Your natural reaction as a human being is to sympathise with them. And I think that's fine. You can show your humanity and you can sympathise with a victim of war, whatever side they're on. But I think you have to still maintain a distance and say we're not on any one side. And you also have to treat the claims of the Ukrainian government with due fact-checking and skepticism, and whatever the British government say as well. Because all the cliches around war, the fog of war, the claims and counterclaims, propaganda, are real. And it's not necessarily that people are trying to deliberately lie to us, but they're trying to tell a story and they're trying to paint a picture. And it's our job to try and see, understand what they're doing and put it all in perspective. I think it's a real challenge, obviously, because the public will obviously generally on the whole feel one way. But I think if we say, well, we're on that side too, then we've kind of broken the basic law.
But how difficult is it, I suppose, when you're seeing, people with flags on their Twitter and Facebook and all your friends are giving donations and so on? I mean, there was always the idea that certainly at the BBC you checked in your politics at the door.
Yeah.
But how can you sort of police that in a newsroom?
Checking your politics at the door, I think, doesn't mean that individual journalists can't make donations to Ukrainian funds and all those sorts of things and can't in their personal lives support things. But checking your politics at the door is about your output and your work. And that's the same as any political opinion. Everybody has political opinions, but you have to check them and sort of deliberately sort of fight against them and think about the other side. And I think that has to be the same with every story. You don't just say, this is different. We can put aside our normal standards.
I've obviously watched you on television for a long time. We've been in the same professional space for sort of 5 or 6 years, and I have absolutely no idea what your personal politics are. I have no idea how you vote, and I would never dream of asking you. But I probably do know, and I think a number of people feel they know how, and I'm not asking you to take responsibility for other colleagues or anything, but they perhaps feel they know that other presenters on Channel 4 News, or perhaps a recently departed presenter on Channel 4 News, isn't perhaps a raging Tory. Channel 4 News certainly has the reputation of being on the left. Is that fair or not fair?
Well, I think it's unfair. I kind of understand why it happens, in that Channel 4 as an organisation and Channel 4 News as well has a particular duty to report unheard voices, go to uncovered places, and to target and serve younger viewers as well. And so the concerns of those audiences, may well fall into, more of those categories of, progressive politics, social liberalism, causes abroad. But there is absolutely no work dictated or Channel 4 dictated position on anything. And we don't come at stories with an agenda. And as you say, I don't know what most of my colleagues think about a lot of things. Obviously, in the office, people express opinions. They express personal opinions. People often get stuff out in the office so that it doesn't come out on air. So there are some people, and you guessed one of them. I know what his politics are, but Craig Oliver, who was David Cameron's spin doctor, was a programme editor on Channel 4 News. I had no idea what his politics were. We used to duff up Conservatives and Labour and everybody else, the same way. Our approach was absolutely the same. So, I think it's also easy to forget that if you've had a Conservative Prime Minister since 2010, our job as Channel 4 News is generally to cause trouble for people in power. That is that's a Conservative government. The opposition inevitably do not get as much of a kicking because they're not responsible for anything. I was going to say they don't do anything. That's not quite fair. But obviously, you are uncovering or turning over or challenging the government a lot more than you're challenging the opposition a lot of the time. So it's easy to forget that we did that with Labour. We were very, very unpopular with the Labour government as well. And there were periods where we wouldn't get Labour ministers, and John Reid would ignore us for months on end when he was the Home Secretary. And Alistair Campbell, if you ask Alistair Campbell what he used to think of Channel 4 News, we were a pain in the neck. So that is our job, to be a pain in the neck for whoever's in power. And it's just that we've had a Conservative Prime Minister for 12 years, and it's easy to forget.
Take some questions from YouTube, but also want to take some in the room as well. Just put up your hand if you have a question for Krishnan. This chap here, just wait till the microphone's coming to you. If you can say your name and if you are affiliated with college or anything, or, just behind you there.
Yeah, hi Krishnan. Thank you. Very inspirational. So thank you very much. I found it really engaging. So thank you. So I'm Dan Harris. I'm a second-year history and politics student at Worcester College, and I'm also deputy editor of the Oxford Student. So I just wanted to ask, what advice do you have for student journalists? Because I wanted to ask a specific question because you talked about how highly opinionated news broadcast media is starting to become more dominant in Britain. We've seen that in the US already. So what advice do you have for student journalists in terms of how we can actually resist the temptation to move towards that highly opinionated news broadcast media and actually stay true to being impartial and prioritising precise information and impartiality for our audiences? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, be careful is what I'd say. I mean, I really feel for some of those British journalists working at RT, the Russian state television, who, and I've been to the RT offices in Moscow and met British journalists who then quietly came up to me and said, look, it's a nightmare here, blah, 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 but, I've ended up here because I couldn't get a job anywhere else, and then I ended up moving here and all those sorts of things. So, and services here as well, that once you go down that road, it's really hard to pull back. Some will, if Andrew Neil can move from GB News to Channel 4, anybody can. So it's not the end of the world, but I would try my best, if at all possible, to build my career in the services that I admire, rather than just going anywhere for the sake of the job.
Just one question from YouTube here. Richard Parfitt has asked, do you think the public is good at recognising impartiality when they see it, or do they tend to see those with views as similar to their own as being more impartial?
Probably. I mean, I don't know, but I'm just guessing as an individual. Yes, obviously, if you're more likely to say they are fair if you see your values more obviously reflected on the TV. And I think it's a real trap at the moment because you can make yourself feel very popular in the media, by saying the right thing to a tribe, getting loads of praise on social media. You might do an interview a particular way or say something, and you'll get loads of social media following, and people will retweet you and share you and send you messages. And it's very seductive. You start to feel loved by this bunch of people who you don't know who they are. But, you've got to keep feeding the beast. You've got to be that person and give more away. Now, some people thrive on it, and some people are thriving on being opinionated figures. I just kind of, as I said in the speech, I think there is a danger in us mixing up all of these different types of services and imagining that they are the same, because they're not.
Another question in the hall, perhaps over here. If you just wait for a microphone to get to you, please.
wise. My claim for fame is I'm married to Linda Davis, who is the first winner of the Philip Geddes Awards, so that's why I'm here. Thank you very much for your lecture. Perhaps, as far as I'm concerned, the most important question that anyone can ask at this time is how you can present the facts to the Russians. You say we're not at war. We may not be at war kinetically, but in terms of battles for narrative, the winning of the battle for the narrative in Russia is perhaps the most important issue. And if you represent a truth, the narrative, how are you going to get it across? Can you get it across?
Well, I mean, you can and you can't. I mean, obviously the sharing of our material across YouTube and social media means that we do have an international, global audience now, and we can see where people watch Channel 4 News, and it is literally all over the world. And it's very interesting. You know, we put on some special noon news, half-hour newses this week, and they got virtually no television viewers, sort of 100,000 television viewers live, but they're getting sort of 2 million views on YouTube. But that is obviously dependent on the Russians not blocking services, and they are. So if the Russian state wants to block us, we will find it very difficult to get our material viewed there. The BBC is obviously now providing or putting back on shortwave radio services, and so they have a chance of reaching Russians, and it will be harder to block radio services than it will be internet services. But, you know, in an information war in which most people, and I'm sure the same as in Russia, are getting their information, you know, from one of these, it is relatively easy for authoritarian states to control what you see on that. So the answer is not a very satisfactory one, I'm afraid. But I think the best chance is to continue supporting the BBC World Service. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Charlie Steinman on YouTube asks, are there any topics that in your view are impossible to have an unbiased debate about? Climate change and vaccinations are often used as examples for ridicule, but is there any merit in debating them anyway?
I don't quite understand that story. That's that question.
I think he's asking, there are some things that there is just, you know, the vaccine.
Oh, I see. Sorry, yeah. No, well,
change.
that's what I was alluding to as well in that research that shows that what the research suggests is that quite a lot of younger people and people on the left think that when we debate things, like Brexit, usually is the example often given, we are giving a false equivalence, or, you know, we used to debate, we don't anymore, I mean, but we did used to debate climate change with people who didn't really believe it was a thing. Yes, I mean, you learn to some extent. We don't debate whether racism is good or bad, or whether murder is good or bad. You know, there are certain things that we just accept. But having said that, you know, even those sorts of things that we now think are completely blindingly obvious, you know, have changed with time, particularly with, you know, social attitudes and, you know, sexual behavior and all those sorts of things. These are things that do change with time. So, are some debates a waste of time? Definitely. But on the whole, you know, if you've got two people who disagree and they represent sizable constituencies, that's a debate worth having. It's only if you're struggling to the point where you spend days trying to find somebody to represent a point of view, then you know it's not a very representative point of view, so what are you doing? You know?
Another question in the hall, perhaps. This lady over here.
I'm Charlie Hancock. I'm a second-year human scientist at Hartford, and I'm one of the outgoing editors-in-chief at Cardwell. I'm interested to hear your assessment of how broadcasters and news outlets should handle fringe perspectives, some might argue conspiratorial perspectives, which may have arisen recently. Obviously, Mariana Spring has done some very pioneering work on this for the BBC. Hello. So where do you think that the balance should lie between addressing some of these potentially dangerous viewpoints and misinformation, and maybe giving them a platform but an opportunity to rebut them, or by giving out more accurate information, but in a way that could drive these groups perhaps further underground?
I think, well, there are a couple of different ways, aren't there? You can cover them as a movement, as a story, as something that's happening. And that is just a question of applying the same journalistic rigor and standards to them as a story as you would anything else. Here's a movement of people who are spreading information this particular way. It's an interesting phenomenon. Let's go and talk to them and see what they think. Let's examine what they say. That's rubbish, that might be true. All those sorts of ways. It shouldn't really ever be the role of news to platform people. And I think you've got to be really careful with things like the question time. Let's invite a load of anti-vaxxers into a room to talk about it. I thought that was a really odd decision in my view. But I think you've just got to use the same standards. You've got to check what they're saying, challenge them if they're saying things that you know to be untrue, and make sure that you've got the other point of view represented.
Another question from YouTube. If the culture wars are vacuous and don't matter, should broadcasters just ignore the stories that result from them? How can you cover the Colston statue toppling, Oxford's own roads controversy, or debates over self-ID and trans issues if you think divisive cultural topics are not worth examining?
I don't think they're not worth examining. I think culture wars have got massively out of control and proportion. And these are all, all of these movements are based around racial equality, sexual equality, gender equality. These are all good things to be examining and to be covering. And we should do them. I'm not saying don't do them. I'm just saying that you mustn't be manipulated into a situation where everything becomes through the prism of the culture war and everything gets turned into a polarized debate, and that the same people who were arguing, about, one topic end up sort of migrating to the next topic and becoming the voices of that. And you create these sort of stars or monsters in the media who are just kind of the controversial voice of whatever today's pet cultural topic, culture war topic is.
Okay. Some more questions in the room, perhaps. Hand back there, if you just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, my name's Jacqueline Williams. I don't have a claim to fame. But I would like to ask how you protect children from seeing, how you really, it's an editorial question, I guess. How do you protect children from seeing the appalling sights that we are going to see, no doubt, when the Russians get to Kiev? How are you going to protect, how do you do that in a way which is true and honest without frightening children in this country?
Okay, thank you.
I mean, it's something I've been talking about a lot recently because it's the 50th anniversary of Newsround coming up, and we've been looking back at some of the things we used to do in the early 90s when I worked on that programme, and actually I think we've become a lot more conservative now with what we show on television. I was looking back at some of the programmes we did in the early 90s around the famine in Somalia. And Newsround was showing very distressing footage of starving children. And similarly, I covered things like the Bosnian War and earthquakes and all those sorts of things. So, and we did actually show quite distressing material. I think the rules, the Ofcom rules, are enforced a lot more now, and we generally in the media have become a lot more protective of our audiences. Now, it's right to obviously protect, parents have a right in children's television to be able to sit their children down in front of the TV and for them not to be scared and terrorised and start crying. You don't have a right as a parent to put your child in front of Channel 4 News and for that child not to be afraid. It's a grown-up programme, essentially. I know it's before the watershed, but we deal with very serious things. So, if anything, it's kind of the same standards when it comes to frightening people apply with adults. It's an argument we have a lot, actually, on the programme, in that there are rules like if you have quite distressing material. So there was a shot last week of a plane, a very low-flying jet, what seemed to be firing a rocket, and then there was a crying child heard. There was nothing actually gory about that shot, but it was definitely distressing. And we were now in a situation where we were saying, we can't use that at the top of our program because we're not able to warn people. The warning has become very important. So we have to say now, in very distressing material, you might be distressed if you're watching this, etc., and try and script into it in a way that sort of prepares people for what they're about to say. So these are sort of day-to-day decisions. I tend to err more on the side of, showing as close to the truth as you can. War is grim, war is terrifying. And covering it in a way that doesn't terrify people, in a way is perverse. It should terrify people. It's terrifying.
I'm going to take 2 more questions from YouTube, and then we'll take a couple more in the room, and then we'll finish. Abby Chitty from YouTube says, how do you prioritize stories when there are ongoing conflicts internationally? Do some conflicts get more coverage than others? Well, I think she's asking, why do some conflicts get more coverage than others? For example, Ukraine versus Afghanistan, Yemen, etc.
Yeah.
And then a second question, do you think people who have left the BBC and ITV for GB News and LBC have damaged trust in our public service broadcasters? Are they monsters too? A well-known monster, Emily Maitlis.
Yeah. How do you prioritise? I mean, yes, there is no doubt that the British media does prioritise stories that it feels the majority of its audience will respond to or relate to. And we've seen in the sort of, the accidental honesty of various correspondents over the last few days, that if the correspondents feel closer to this war than Yemen or Syria or Afghanistan, then you've got a basic problem, because you've got a cultural problem within those newsrooms. It may just be that most people haven't gone to those places. I've been to Yemen and I've been to Afghanistan, and people are people, so you react to all of those situations the same way if you've covered those sorts of wars. And so all the language around Ukraine being totally unprecedented and as being in totally uncharted waters has seemed totally bizarre to me. We know exactly how the Russians operate in a war situation because we saw it in Syria. And the images are very, very similar now in terms of what's likely to happen in many of these places. So yes, I think there are cultural biases. They do affect editorial judgments. Many of us are sort of fighting against that and kicking against that all the time and trying to sort of, prod our colleagues who all say, yes, you're absolutely right, but then maybe fall back into, the same traps. In terms of how people, individuals, I mean, I'm not interested in criticising individuals. I don't blame Emily Maitlis for going to LBC. I'm sure they're paying her a load of money and she'll have loads of fun. And she's brilliant. And I'm sure she'll be back on TV before too long. But no, I mean, I'm talking about the sort of, I'm wondering what the overall impact of these things is going to be. And the building of these services means less journalism. More talk is less journalism. If you're paying big stars hundreds of thousands of pounds or millions of pounds to come onto your services and, natter on about stuff, they're not out on the road. They're not doing journalism. They're not uncovering things. And that is really bad. That just means it's then, it's us and the BBC and ITV left to do that. And, with all these news services, I wish just one of these news services, which had loads of money, was going out there trying to do original journalism. And they don't seem to be. The only ones who are really small, and are probably going to go bust before too long and don't have any resources.
Okay. We'll take a couple more questions in the room if there are. Oh, well, there are quite a few. There's one just right at the very back there. If just wait for the microphone.
Hi, my name is Mary Morgan. I work for BBC Media Action. I was very encouraged by what you said about TV viewing figures going up over the last week, with particularly young people tuning in to watch news of the war. But at the same time, I'm very conscious that lots of young people consume most of their news through social media. We have streaming platforms and the death, perhaps, of appointment to view news. And I'm also very conscious of the end of the BBC licence fee. So I wanted to ask how you see the future of public interest broadcasting, how relevant you think TV news in particular will be going forward, and whether it's something you worry about. Also, any ideas you might have for the direction it might go in.
Obviously, it's something I worry about, but I have been warned about this for 30 years, and I've been debating it. And obviously, audiences are fragmenting into different parts of the internet and different social media services. But appointment to view television isn't over. You know, Channel 4 News, the BBC 10 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, the 6:30 news actually is the most watched TV news, the regional TV slot. These are appointment to view slots, and they're still very, very strong, really, really watched by huge numbers of people. And even if Channel 4 News is getting between 600,000 and 1.2 million people on television, that's a snapshot figure. It's who's watching at any one point in time for a few minutes. The reach of these programs is much bigger. So the consciousness around Channel 4 News, the number of people that might watch it over a week, is millions and millions. So even if we're a minority program, we're hitting a huge number of people. So I think our death has been called many times, and I don't think we're there yet. And I think, maybe I didn't say it clearly enough, I think things like Ukraine, things like COVID, will make those people who think it's all over for the licence fee on the BBC think again. You know, if our only way of ensuring British impartial journalism is reaching Russians is through the BBC World Service, then I think the BBC's probably got a future. You know, I think it's going to be fine. And all the talk of different models is very difficult to deliver until you can turn off the digital terrestrial signal. And that requires the internet to be at really, really good speed everywhere. Because you can't have this mixed, there's a lot of nonsense talked about, different models for BBC funding at the moment, about having a mixed economy of subscription and taxpayer funding. It won't work until everybody can do it. And you can't split the TV signal into some subscriptions, some not. So I think so many people have looked at the BBC licence fee for so long, over so many years, and nobody's ever come up with a really better way of doing it. There are little better ways of tweaks, but the basic principle that we should as a nation pay for something we believe in and trust and think is a good thing, I think will preserve. And even if it comes out in different forms or a different way of charging it, and maybe if people who are on lower incomes are in some way subsidised by people on higher incomes, all of those things are up for grabs. Maybe that will happen. But I think fundamentally, it's not dead yet.
I'm going to take two more questions at the same time, one there and one there, if that's okay. Sorry if you haven't had time to get your questions in.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the speech, Mr. Guru-Murthy. It was great. I'm Alex Foster. I am the outgoing editor of the Oxford Student and was shortlisted for the prize this year. My question is, since Brexit, there's been an ongoing flood of, quote, negative news. There's COVID, there's Trump on January 6th, Partygate, and now Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Doom scrolling is a new term for a reason. You've spoken about how public service broadcasting is there to present the facts, to uncover the truth. What place is there for positive or entertaining news where the only fact is kind of happiness and where there's no truth to be uncovered?
Okay, and we'll take the other question at the same time from that lady, if that's all right.
Hi, I'm Charlie Kingsley, and I'm a journalism student. I just wanted to ask, what's the limit for a journalist? Because 20 or 30 years ago, I completely, understand having a journalist go out into Afghanistan or into a war-torn zone. But, at the moment, out of my own choice, I'm 23 years old, so I get most of my news from my phone. Out of my own choice and not out of my own choice, I get news articles coming up with lots of, vivid images and as what feels as close as seeing a journalist somewhere. I don't feel better watching the BBC News or Channel 4 News and seeing a journalist in a war-torn area where journalists have been beheaded and killed and captured and imprisoned for trying to, fight for freedom of speech. So I just want to know, where is the limit for a journalist, and at what point can we understand that there is a limit to how much we can trust media that we receive online, and just being sensible in keeping people safe when delivering the news?
Thanks very much indeed to both questioners.
There are good news is like, again, it's a debate that's gone on forever. And personally, I don't really watch the news to be cheered up. I watch drama or comedy to be cheered up. So it doesn't really bother me, but I totally understand the need for some balance in longer programs. There are lots of uplifting stories that we do about the environment, or, I suppose I've been thinking about Newsround a lot recently, and we used to very consciously balance out that program with animal stories and pandas and space and all those sorts of things. There is an argument for a little bit of that in the news, especially at the moment. And we do, we literally, in our program meeting, at 2 o'clock or 2:15, we'll go, God, it's all a bit grim, isn't it? You want to slit your wrist. Is there anything uplifting we can put in? And that's often culture. So that's why we will often do an interview with a pop star or an actor or an arts group or a gallery opening or those sorts of things, which we can kind of say, well, it is news because it's culture and it's stuff that's going on. But that's where we kind of get a little bit of texture, or just a different kind of interview with somebody. Is how we try and sort of change the relentless, bash you over the head with terrible news feel of a program. And it is a thing that, you have to craft a program to try and get people to stay with you. Otherwise, if it is relentless, people will turn off. For example, simple thing on Channel 4 News, at 7:30, quite a lot of people turn over. They flip channels at 7:30 because maybe they've watched the one show and they're looking for something else to watch. So if we put our most grabby, interesting feature at 7:30, we quite often find that people stay with us and that we get a little boost. So you do sort of work to try and keep people and to give them a little bit of, well, I wouldn't say joy, but something that's going to change the tone a little bit. In terms of, I'm not sure I completely understood what you were saying, but in terms of what the personal limit, if you like, for dangerous places is the people who go to dangerous places for us tend to be either themselves very experienced or working with very experienced people. We work as a team. In the old days, we used to go to places and just kind of do what we wanted on the ground. These days, it's a very team, very much a team effort. You never go anywhere out of the hotel in a war zone unless everybody in the team has discussed it, said, right, this is what we're planning to do. Are we all happy to go? If anyone's got to worry, you don't go. And you don't even do that, because what you usually have to do is call back to a boss in London who's in charge of security, who may have themselves a security advisor, who's looking at the map, who's looking at the latest intelligence about what's going on the ground, and they will authorize you to move. So the risks we take in television are calculated risks. And I'm always saying to my children, it looks a lot more dangerous than it is. It shouldn't. But some of it is risky, some of it is dangerous, but we try and make it as controlled and as careful as possible.
So I think we've come to the end of an absolutely fascinating lecture and discussion. And on behalf of the St Edmund Hall, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Krishnan for your superb talk, and also Peter for chairing those questions so beautifully. I'd also like to say a very big thank you to the Geddes Trust. You do a fantastic job in keeping alive Philip Geddes' memory, and also really supporting and moving forwards the next generation of journalists to really take on all those points that were being made today about making this a sort of a way of ensuring that we get true news coming through that is unbiased. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'm sad to draw to close this evening. I've so enjoyed this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Krishnan. That was brilliant. Really brilliant.
I don't know how long I spoke for.
No, you're perfect. It's perfect time. Yeah. It was about half an hour. Yeah, it was perfect.